Coming on. Yes, John. You want to light the light?
Yeah, Hamza, let you do the lights, inshallah.
من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد. So the topic today is about knowing God through reason, through intellect, or intuition, and how various early Muslim scholars and philosophers and movements went about understanding this particular aspect of theology. Now, the problem that I had coming here is I didn't know the level of the students. I'm going to talk to a bunch of graduates from SOAS, I'm going to talk to Muslims who are interested in the field, and whoever I asked wasn't able to give me an answer. And so I'm going to speak from my heart, kind of sort of semi-academic and if you like, religious or Islamic. So I hope I don't lose some of you, and I hope I'm not too boring for others. I hope the majority, inshallah, are able to benefit and follow along. So let's begin from the beginning. What we're talking about basically is kalam, and the way that early kalam scholars viewed this field, and how those who opposed kalam objected to their views. So we first have to define kalam. Kalam is a science that is difficult to define, and it's been the subject of hundreds of PhDs and doctoral dissertations. It's difficult to define kalam from philosophy. It's difficult to differentiate the two, and that is why some of the modern academics actually conflate the two, and they say kalam is merely a branch of philosophy. And that is a madhab or opinion out there. But in fact, kalam is different from philosophy. And kalam is dialectic theology. In other words, you are having a rational, cosmological basis of reality upon which you base your theology. So you base your theology not from texts, not from scripture, but from rationality.
I think we talked about that. I'm going to just stop and sort of explain to you, because inshallah it is a quite high level video. So the first point that he makes is to define this particular deviancy, which is called kalam, or ilm al-kalam. And he said that ilm al-kalam is different from philosophy in the sense that ilm al-kalam means to base your religion upon rational beliefs, rationality, and to understand the whole of your religion within a framework of rational belief. And he's going to explain a bit about how this belief came into being and how it started in Islam.
Now, how is that not philosophy? This is the whole question, because that is a type of philosophy. Philosophy is you base your ethics, you base your morality from intellect. So is kalam, except that kalam is kind of sort of in the middle between philosophy and pure religion or pure scriptural theology. And so it's difficult to demarcate the two, but there are many differences between falsafa and kalam. And we'll talk about some of them, but that's not the topic of this class. So I'll take it as a given that kalam is different than falsafa, because I think it definitely is. Kalam first began at the turn of the 2nd Islamic century. And generally, a person by the name of Ja'ad ibn Dirham is accredited with starting this type of dialectic theology. Ja'ad ibn Dirham died roughly 110 Hijrah, and I apologize, but all of them.
Okay, so here we're hearing about the beginnings. What's the first thing you notice about the beginning of this deviancy in Aqidah? When did it begin? After the 2nd century, so after the death of the companions. So this is a deviancy that didn't begin during the life of the companions. And we're talking about the Abbasid period and coming into that in a moment.
That's the way I think we wrote Islam. To convert, you can just write the date and convert yourself later on. Ja'ad ibn Dirham passed it on to his main student, Jaham ibn Safwan. Now, these two guys were the earliest people who actually began talking about the concept of God's attributes. The controversy over God's attributes never arose before these guys. These were the first people to begin talking about how we understand the attributes of God in the Quran. Before these two guys, you had controversies over faith. What is the reality of faith, Iman? Who should have been the caliph, Ali or Abu Bakr? What is the role of the caliph? How about divine predestination? How much does God know? How much does God control? So you had groups like the Kharijites, the Murji'ites, you had the early Shia, you had all of these other groups forming. This is before this controversy.
So we've heard about those early groups because I've introduced you to all of those groups, the Kharijites, the Khawarij, and to the early Shia and how they developed. So he's already skipped over that bit and I've already covered that bit. What we're covering is much later. So that happened during the time of the companions, but during the time of Ali, during the time of Uthman, there was no discussion about Allah's names and attributes. Nobody said, what does it mean that Allah is Ar-Rahman? What does it mean that Allah is As-Sami' Al-Alim? Nobody actually had any issues with it. This issue started with this guy, Ja'd ibn Dirham, and his main student, Jaham ibn Safwan.
Nobody ever talks about God and the nature of God. The first people to come forth with this type of thought are these two people, Ja'd and Jahm. And their primary theology is very difficult to reconstruct what these people believe, because we don't have a single book that they actually wrote. And all of the material that is attributed to them is attributed by their enemies, either the Sunnis or the Mu'tazilites. We don't have any books that they themselves wrote. Even though Jahm wrote a few books, we don't have any existing books of it. And just FYI for your information, my master's dissertation was on Jahm ibn Safwan, and it is printed in Arabic. It is called, in Arabic, the theological positions of Jahm ibn Safwan and his effects on the Muslim Ummah. So I can talk a lot about Jahm, and that's not the topic of this talk either. In any case, so these are the guys that first start talking about God's attributes. Contemporaneously to this, there are other movements going on as well. And of those movements is the movement of, or the theological position of, what do we do with somebody who's a believer, but not a good believer? What if he's a Muslim but he drinks? What if he's a Muslim but he womanizes? What if he's a Muslim but he steals? He's a bad Muslim. Is he a Muslim or is he not? So the theological position of how do we define faith, what constitutes minimal faith, is going on contemporaneously. And of course, a lot of people are talking about this, but of the earliest people to really make a statement and make a scene is somebody by the name of Wasil ibn Ata. Wasil ibn Ata. Wasil ibn Ata died, if my memory serves me right, roughly 128, I think, around that time. These are all rough dates, except for these other among them. But Wasil was roughly 120 something. So Wasil ibn Ata is really one of the first people to begin a movement that is clearly distinct from both Kharijism and Sunnism, which both existed. We should not.
So we know that Kharijism, or the Khawarij, we talked about, they existed, the beginnings in the time of the killing of Uthman, and then Ali. And then we said that what happened was that the Kharijites, who existed from Uthman and then Ali, they eventually killed Ali. One of the key things they said is that someone who is a Muslim who does sins is not a Muslim. A major sins is not a Muslim. So a Muslim who drinks is not a Muslim, and they would kill the Muslims who did anything in their opinion to be against Islam. Later on we have this guy Wasil ibn Ata, and he comes and he defines a movement based upon what to do with Muslims who don't practice Islam properly. This didn't exist in the Sahaba. You didn't really have Sahaba who didn't practice Islam properly. You had some issues, but those were dealt with by the Prophet ﷺ or by the Khulafa. But when the Khawarij came, you're dealing with people who spend their time drinking, womanizing, whatever. And the Khawarij's methodology is that they are killed. What's our methodology, our aqidah? What do we believe? We say that a Muslim does not leave Islam by a major sin that he does. Muslim does not leave Islam by a major sin that he does. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says Allah does not forgive that you make a partner with him, and he forgives anything else for whoever he wills. So it's very possible that someone could drink alcohol, die with a glass of wine in his hand, and be forgiven if Allah wishes to forgive him, but he deserves to be punished. He deserves a punishment, but if he's not punished and Allah forgives him, that's up to Allah. What the Khawarij said is, they said, no, he's a disbeliever. As soon as you drink a glass of alcohol, you leave Islam. As soon as you commit zina, you leave Islam. As soon as you trim your beard or shave your beard, you leave Islam. As soon as you don't wear the hijab, you leave Islam, and so on and so forth. So they would murder people based on that. This guy, he established a different belief system based on the same issue.
We should not say Sunnism at this time, we should say Proto-Sunnism, because the Sunni movement as it is actually developed after him. But Proto-Sunnism and Kharijism are existent at this time. Wasil ibn Ata comes and he puts forth a position: the sinning Muslim is neither a disbeliever nor is he a Muslim. He's kind of sort of in a limbo status. Manzila bayna manzilatayn. Okay? He's in a quandary. He's in a unique box. He's neither a Muslim nor a Kafir. Before this time, Sunnis to this day consider a sinning Muslim to be a Muslim. Kharijites to this day, there are still Kharijite movements, consider a sinning Muslim to be a non-Muslim. So this guy comes along and he goes, they're right in the middle. We don't call them Muslim, we don't call them non-Muslim.
And that's a deviancy like we've heard, because we said that the only belief that is acceptable is the belief in the Quran. Allah does not forgive you to make a partner with Him, but He forgives anything less than that for whoever He wills. So we do not say that the Sahabi who came and he drank alcohol and they said, and they beat him and they began to curse him, and the Messenger of Allah ﷺ said, do not curse him, for he loves Allah and His Messenger. Do not curse him, for he loves Allah and His Messenger. This is a Sahabi who drank alcohol. And the Prophet ﷺ said, do not curse him, for he loves Allah and His Messenger. And the woman who committed zina and she was stoned to death, and the Sahaba were cursing her when they stoned her, he said, do not curse her, because she has repented a repentance that if it was shared among 70 of the people of Medina, it would be enough for them. So it's clear that during the time of the companions, they believe that the person who does a major sin is a Muslim. The Khawarij come and they say, we execute anybody who does a major sin, they're a disbeliever. This guy comes and says, no, I've got a better opinion based on my theology from here or here, my Greek or my whatever he's learned from wherever he's got Christian theology. And he says they're not a believer and they're not a disbeliever. They're exactly in the middle. They don't get paradise, so they don't get hellfire, they get like a limbo state in between.
Okay, Wasil ibn Ata is accredited, and I do believe this to be true, with the founding of the actual Mu'tazilite movement. Mu'tazilite, or Mu'tazila.
So he's the founder of another sect. So far the sects we've heard about are the Khawarij, the early Shia, and now the Mu'tazila, founded by Wasil ibn Ata. And we've just begun to hear about the Jahmiyyah, who were founded by Jahm ibn Safwan. So we've heard about the Khawarij, we've heard about the Shia, and we've heard about the Mu'tazila. He's using English terminology, Mu'tazilite, Kharijite, but I think it's a waste of time, to be quite honest. Just stick with the Arabic. And then we started to hear about the Jahmiyyah. So the Khawarij come from the time of Uthman, but really were prominent during the time of Ali. Likewise, the Shia on the other side, in the time of Ali. The Mu'tazila came from this guy, Wasil ibn Ata, and the Jahmiyyah from Jahm ibn Safwan. And you saw the kind of dates we're looking at. The kind of dates, Ali radiallahu anh died around about 40 years after the Hijrah. So here we're looking at sort of 30 to 40 years after the Hijrah. Here we're looking at whatever 128 years after the Hijrah. And here, whatever he wrote before, we're looking at the 110 or whatever after the Hijrah. These kind of ages. So you can see that we're looking at something later than, than the Sahaba, and later than, the guidance of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
He is the one who began the Mu'tazilite movement. Wasil ibn Ata did not talk about God's attributes. As far as we can tell, this was not a controversy to him. It's too early on. He's too early to really talk about that. But he influences his brother-in-law and his main student, Amr ibn Ubayd. Amr ibn Ubayd. And Amr ibn Ubayd died around 148 Hijrah.
So now we've got Amr ibn Ubayd.
Amr ibn Ubayd was the first person, really, to kind of sort of meld these two trends together. And he brought forth a theology that included elements of God's attributes denying them, elements of Wasil ibn Ata's status limbo, in between the two statuses, and also another movement which we're not going to really talk about, the Qadarites, who were talking about predestination and denying it, or saying God does not know and control the future. So he basically took from Wasil ibn Ata, Ja'd ibn Dirham, and the Qadarites, and he took Mu'tazilism to a different level. He took Mu'tazila into stage 2. And really,
so here now, we've added in the Qadariyah who we talked about during the time of Abdullah ibn Umar. They appeared during the time of Abdullah ibn Umar. So we're talking still towards, 30 to 40 years after the Hijrah, perhaps something like that. And this guy, Amr ibn Ubaid, he feeds in, and this is critical that you understand this, that deviancy in Islam didn't stay like that. Don't think that the Shia stayed just preferring Ali over Uthman. Everything changes when it molds. People come and they pick a bit of this and a bit of that and they make a new sect. And they pick a bit of this and a bit of that and a new sect forms. So the later Shia are not like the early Shia. Here we have Amr ibn Ubaid. And Amr ibn Ubaid takes a bit of the Qadariyah that talked to Ibn Umar, or Ibn Umar talked about them. He takes a bit of the early Mu'tazila that Wasil ibn Ata talks about, and he takes the Jahmiyyah, denying Allah's attributes from Jahm ibn Safwan, and he mixes all of them together, and he comes out with the new Mu'tazila, or the Mu'tazila version 2. The new and improved Mu'tazila, with kufr from all over the place. They brought kufr from here and kufr from there and kufr from here, and so he made a whole new brand of kufr, the upgraded Mu'tazila.
In my opinion, Amr ibn Ubaid is the real founder of Mu'tazili thought. Why? Because Wasil ibn Ata did not talk about God's attributes. We don't really have much about him to do with Adam. It's really this guy here who brings together a number of different strands and takes Mu'tazilism to a different level. At this stage, we don't really have sophisticated proofs or intellectual theorems theorizing any of these things. They're just simplistic notions. Greek thought has yet to hit the Muslim Ummah.
Okay, so this is a critical point. At this point, there is no Greek theology. There's no evidence for this. People are just like, it's just some random twisted guy with some issues, and he's going to talk in a minute about where those issues might have come from, Christianity, Judaism, wherever. But at the moment, they're very unsophisticated. They just, we believe that these Muslims are like this. We believe that Allah doesn't hear anything. We believe that Allah isn't merciful. And they just kept it very very simplistic. They didn't really have any serious arguments to bring. And that was because Greek philosophy had yet to come in. Once Greek philosophy comes in, bam, that's it. Now they have all the arguments and all of the ammunition they need to fire at the Muslims. For now, they're outcast. They're one or two people in a sea of believers. But we'll see soon what happens.
Aristotle and Plato have yet to be translated. So Amr ibn Ubaid is getting these ideas. Where does he get them from? This is a really, really deep question. Interesting question. We're never going to know. How in 140 Hijrah is he talking about issues that are clearly Neoplatonic, clearly Aristotelian, but he cannot express them in Platonic and Aristotelian language because he doesn't know them, he hasn't read them. Where is he getting it from? I mean, the ideas are there. We're talking about issues that are found in other religions.
So you understand the issue here. He's saying, if Aristotle's work hadn't been translated, and this guy is quoting Aristotle, how did he manage to do it? He's not quoting him word for word, but he's quoting the beliefs of Aristotle more or less on the dot, and Plato and some of the Neoplatonism and Platonism and all the rest. Where is he getting this Greek theology from when Greek theology hasn't been translated yet? We hear his theory for it.
Cultures in Greek and Roman ideologies, but he hasn't been exposed to them directly. In my master's dissertation, just FYI, I propose, and this is something that I haven't seen anybody else follow up with, I propose another line, and this is something perhaps one of you can write a research paper on, because I don't have time to use things this really yet. But Amr ibn Ubaid took this general thought from Jahm ibn Safwan. That's well known. Jahm ibn Safwan took it from Ja'd ibn Dirham. That's also well known. I propose a figure up here, which really nobody else had really concentrated on before. And that is John of where? John of Damascus. John of Damascus. John of Damascus is a very interesting figure. And it has been corroborated that Ja'd lived at the same time as John in Damascus, in the same quarters as John of Damascus. Same time, same place. But nobody ever said that Ja'd studied with John. I was really the first person to say that, and I could be wrong. The reason I said that, if you read his writings, and they're still existent. Now, John of Damascus was a type of minister to the Umayyad Khalifa at the time.
We talked about this, how the Umayyads had ministers that were not Muslim because they were good.
The Romans are being given high positions because they're educated, they're literate, they're bureaucrats. And so the Umayyads come along and they take the Jews and the Christians and they give them high ministerial, secretarial positions because these guys know how to run a country. And I mean, not trying to be dismissive, Muslims didn't know how to run a country because they're new. They're just coming out of the woodwork, as they say. So they incorporated a lot of these people into the administration, and John of Damascus was one of the main people to be incorporated. And he wasn't just any Joe Schmo. He was actually a priest. He was actually a very learned scholar, and he was an iconoclast. He's very famous for the issue of iconoclasm. And he has many books still to this day. And he's the first Christian theologian to refute Islam. He has a book printed to this day, English translated. It's called The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. Right? Bid'at al-Ismailiyyin.
So this guy, John of Damascus, may be well the source for all of these innovations. Why? Because if we look and say, where did this Greek methodology come from? We only find one group who were learned enough to know what the Greeks were saying and pass it on. And that was the Christian ministers who were in charge of the time at the time of the Umayyad period. Now they lived in their own quarters and they were cut off from the Muslims. But Ja'd ibn Dirham, here, roughly 110 after the Hijrah, he lived with this guy, John of Damascus, in the same area of Damascus. And John of Damascus was the first person to write a refutation of Islam, called The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. And he was the first Christian to write a refutation of Islam, The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. And he was well learned in Greek philosophy. And it's believed, or it's supposed, that John of Damascus taught Ja'd ibn Dirham. Ja'd ibn Dirham taught Jahm ibn Safwan. He formed the Jahmiyyah. Wasil ibn Ata formed the early Mu'tazila. The early Shia and the Khawarij were there. The Qadariyah were there at the time of Ibn Umar. And bang, Amr ibn Ubayd comes along and he rolls it all up into one. And we have the new Mu'tazila who have taken from Christian theology and they've taken from Greek philosophy through the Christians, and they've also taken from the Mu'tazila and from some of the other groups and the Khawarij and so on and so forth, and they found their own particular belief set. And this continues to happen time after time. These groups split up and they form other groups. We're going to watch 5 more minutes because, inshallah, you guys can get a link for this and watch the whole video. But I only wanted to show you certain points of how he describes this formation of this new sect.
It's like we're the Ishmaelites and we're heretical. The first Christian to ever refute Islam. Now his theology is very, very similar to Ja'd in God's attributes, in issues of qadr, and even, and this is one of the main points that we're coming to, how to prove the existence of God. How to prove the existence of God. Because John of Damascus, in Arabic is called Yuhanna al-Dimashqi, John of Damascus was one of the first people to propose a very God, which we're going to come to in a little while. He has a very rudimentary argument of motion and an object being motionary versus stationary, and the fact that it must have had a cause, etc. Very rudimentary, and it's in his books to this day. You still look it up. He has a book called Fida Orthodox Theology, and it's translated into English, and you can easily find these statements in there. And this is exactly what Ja'd said, and exactly what Jahm said, and exactly what Amr ibn Ubayd said. So I said it doesn't take a genius to link these together. Okay? But this is a theory because we don't know for sure whether these two met. All I could prove, same city, he was in Damascus at the same time, and we even know that he lived in the Christian quarters of the city, which is very rare because in those days cities were divided by religion. So for this guy who claimed to be a Muslim to live in the Christian quarters, I said, everything really points to this one. In any case, that is a separate thing. We don't have time to get into it. Amr ibn Ubayd, let's get back here. So he really took Mu'tazism to a different level. And I would say that these ideas really go back to John of Damascus all the way down here. And, to make a long story short, this is, I would say, real stage 1 of formalization and crystallization of the Mu'tazili madhab. I don't really think Wasil ibn Ata had much more to do than the name. The name was ascribed to him, but in terms of the actual movement, it's Amr ibn Ubayd. Stage 2, this is stage 1, let's say. Stage 2, you have a whole bunch of other people. Stage 3, you have a bunch of people. And stage 2, the main people really are An-Nadham, and Al-Allah, Abu al-Hudayb Al-Allah. And this guy died around 235 or so, okay? Stage 3 are the Juba'is, the nephew and the uncle. And of course, Juba'i is the stepfather of Al-Ash'ari, Abu Hassan Al-Ash'ari.
So now we start to see a little bit of how these theological groups formed. So the Mu'tazila, they had another version and another version, and we're not going to worry about the people. But in those people that the Mu'tazila dealt with, we have this version, these two versions. We have people who start to be relatives or students of or teachers of other movements. The primary movement that we're talking about is the Ash'ariyah. And the Ash'ariyah represent the majority of Muslims today. The majority of the Muslims today attribute themselves to the Ash'ari Aqidah. This is a fact. The majority of Muslims around the Arab world, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, the vast majority attribute themselves to the Ash'ari or the Maturidi or the Ash'ari madhab. Maturidi or the Ash'ari madhab. And these two were relatives, the father-in-law or the relatives by marriage of the people who founded the Mu'tazila, who were the relatives or the students of Amr ibn Ubayd, who learned from Jahm ibn Safwan, who learned from Ja'd ibn Dirham, who learned from John of Damascus. You don't see any companions in here, that's because there isn't any. That's simply because there isn't any. And I'm going to stop the video there and just finish off the discussion myself. Hamza, if you can do the lights for me. So here we see how these sects form. And when you say to somebody, you attribute yourself to somebody who died 300 years after the Prophet ﷺ. And when we trace his lineage back, it goes from shaitan to shaitan. It goes from one to the next. So it begins with one guy. And his father-in-law was Al-Jubbani, who was another guy. And his father, he studied from An-Nadham. And An-Nadham studied from Amr ibn Ubayd, who studied from Jahm ibn Safwan, Ja'd ibn Dirham, John of Damascus. We're not seeing any sharaf in this lineage because there isn't any. It's full of kufr, it's full of disbelief, and it's full of twisted beliefs. Now don't get me wrong, the Ash'aris are much less severe than any of these guys and much closer to the Sunnah. But the reality is, this morphing and changing is not coming from the Aqidah of the Prophet ﷺ. It is coming from the Aqidah of the Christians and the Greeks. And at this point here, at version 3 of the Mu'tazila or version 4, Greek philosophy gets translated, the Abbasids come along, and things start to get really messy because they start to have a real, basis with which to attack the Muslims. And they're attacking them based on the arguments presented in Greek philosophy. And at the end of the day, Greek philosophy came along to support this early innovation in Islam. And so this is what we wanted to talk about today, a little bit of history of deviancy in Islam, where it came from. All of these groups, trace them back one way or another, and you find none of them came from anything good. Either they came from the people who killed Ali, or either they came from the people who exaggerated regarding Ali and hated the Sahaba, or either they came from the people who Abdullah ibn Umar said about them, I am free from them and they are free from me, or either they came from the people who took their knowledge from a Christian monk in Damascus. None of that has any good. The Khawarij, the killers of Ali, the Shia who exaggerated regarding Ali, the Mu'tazila who learned from John of Damascus, and the Qadariyah who Abdullah ibn Umar said, I am free from them and they are free from me. These are the four who essentially all of the other groups came from them. All of the other groups came from them. And if you want, you can put the Jahmiyyah in there as well. And the Jahmiyyah can be sort of considered to be if you like, a founder or a founding part of the Mu'tazila in some ways. So you have sort of 5 groups, and these groups are essentially the heads of innovation in Islam, and this innovation has come through them, and then other figures came along, mixed it with a bit of the sunnah, bit of bid'ah, mix it all up together, we have a new madhab. Take that, bit more sunnah, bit more bid'ah, take it from someone else, mix it up, we have a different madhab. And we see all of these, and by madhab I don't mean the madhahib of fiqh, Hanafi, Hanbali, Shafi, I'm talking about madhahib of aqidah. Your madhab in aqidah as in the Mu'tazila, the Khawarij, the Shia, and so on and so forth. And so essentially none of these come from the sunnah. And that's what we want to emphasize in concluding today, that there was a belief set that came all the way up from here, from the Prophet ﷺ, supported by Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali and the rest of the Sahaba. And that lived on and lives on until today. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, there will always remain a group of my ummah upon the truth, in clear, manifest upon the truth, clear upon the truth. They will not be harmed by those who oppose them until the affair of Allah comes and they remain upon the same belief. How do we know what that belief is? It is the belief that the Prophet ﷺ taught, the belief that Abu Bakr taught, that Umar, that Uthman, that Ali radiallahu anhu, the rest of the Sahaba taught, not the belief of John of Damascus, not the belief of Wasil ibn Ata, or Jahm ibn Safwan, or Amr ibn Ubaid, or the Qadariyah, or the Asha'ira, or the Maturidiyah, or any of those other groups. It is the belief that goes all the way up to the Prophet ﷺ, and you can prove it from him. And from the Prophet ﷺ, of course, it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and this is the belief. As for the name for this belief, there is no name for this belief. You can call it whatever you like, you can call it many names, any name you like. But the reality is that this belief is the belief that our aqidah is the Quran and the Sunnah and the understanding of the companions. The Quran, the Sunnah, and the understanding of the companions. You want to call that whatever you want to call it. Some people call it good names. Some people insult you and call it bad names. Some people call it all sorts of things. But the reality is, if your belief comes from the Quran and the Sunnah in accordance with the belief of the companions, then you are on the right path. And if it comes from anywhere else, any of these guys here, look where it ends up. A Christian monk. Or it ends up with a Hindu priest. Or it ends up with a Buddhist, because the Maturidiyah were influenced after their little bit of bid'ah that they threw in, after they'd sort of come a bit closer to the Sunnah, they threw a bit of Buddhism in there. So just to mix it up a bit, they decided to throw Buddhism into the mix. So there's all sorts of religious influences. But when we take our belief from the Prophet ﷺ, Quran, Sunnah, companions, this belief is solid, it's strong, and it will remain bi'idhnillahi ta'ala until Yawm al-Qiyamah, as the Prophet ﷺ said. Now, inshallah, what I'd like to do, just to finish off, is rather than us have a break because we have only 20 minutes left, I would just like us to just jump straight into the last session. 20 minutes only, inshallah ta'ala. If not, still we're gonna try and finish on time, because we would like, people, we promised that they would go at 5, and maybe they've organised people to pick them up or whatever. Inshallah, we're going to try not to, extend it too long, but inshallah, whatever's easy. Questions, alhamdulillah, they're not a problem. So we just want to spend 5 minutes before the question and answer session, just recapping what it is that we've learned and what it is that we have taken moving forward. We began by talking about what Aqidah is, and we've become, familiar with the topic, what it contains and what it doesn't contain. We've understood the sources for Aqidah are the Quran and the Sunnah and the Ijma', and we talked a little bit about what consensus means and what it doesn't mean. The most important thing we did is to talk about La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, what that means to say La ilaha illallah, that it means that you worship Allah alone and you disbelieve in the worship of anything that is worshipped besides Allah. We talked about what worship is and what worship isn't. And we talked about some of the points that are discussed in Aqidah. Not by any means all of them, but we talked about some of them. And you know, if you want to expand your knowledge of Aqidah, there are a number of books that you can use. I highly, highly, highly recommend a couple of books. One which basically deals with session 2. Okay, and this book deals with session 2 primarily. I have a book for you for session 2 and a book for you for session 3. And the rest I'm going to leave for session 4 is this video here that we did. So the book for session 2 is The Fundamentals of Tawheed. By Dr. Bilal Phillips. And again, Dr. Bilal Phillips is a human being. We do not, take his book as being, this is the Quran summarized or something like that, but it's a good book. And it's a generally correct and valid book that tells you about what we discussed in session 2 in a little bit more detail. As for what we discussed in session 3, I'm going to recommend to you the book of Al-Imam Al-Barbahari. They call it just the Creed, because it's not called the Creed in Arabic. In Arabic it's called the Explanation of the Sunnah, but it's simply called the Creed by Imam Al-Barbahari. By Imam Al-Barbahari. And this basically goes over more advanced topics of creed, like we talked about, the belief about the Sahaba, the belief about the disobedient Muslim, the belief about the Quran, the belief about theology and philosophy. Some of that in a very simple form is covered in that book. As for session 4, you can watch that video, which is a video by Dr. Yasir Qadi, and it's called, I have to get the name properly because it's difficult to find. It's called Knowledge of God, Intuition or something like that. Can we get it?
Knowing God, Reason, and Intuition, Revelation, and Intuition.
That'll do. Knowing God,
Reason, Revelation, and Intuition.
Reason, Revelation, and Intuition. And that doesn't deal with the whole of what we covered today. Al-Barbahari doesn't deal with everything we dealt with in session 3. Tawheed doesn't deal with everything we dealt with in session 2. And this video doesn't deal with everything we dealt with in session 4. But they're good reading that you can build upon, and hopefully you can identify and understand the video Knowing God, Reason, Revelation, and Intuition, which was pretty good. It's pretty advanced, some of the topics, but it's pretty easy to understand as well in some ways. As for the history of the different sects and groups, I don't know a great book in English that goes through the early history of the companions. I know Dar Salam have brought out some regarding the biography of Ali and the history, and so you can find some information if you look for some of the books by Dar Salam publications on the history of. As-Salabi. As-Salabi has another book here. As-Salabi has a number of books. He has a biography of Ali, and I think he has a biography of Uthman as well.
He's got all four. The main one you see, of Abu Bakr and Ali.
He has a biography of the 4 Khulafa. You may find in that some information about the early days, but you might not find everything that you're looking for. But inshallah, this is what we do. We gather together information from the books and we try and present it to you. In the 3rd session, we dealt with obviously the Sahaba. We dealt with some of what happened. We dealt with our beliefs in more detail, and we dealt with some of the more sort of tricky issues, the belief regarding Allah and the issue of putting your intellect ahead of the revelation. And then in the fourth session, we heard a little bit about the history of deviancy in Islam, where deviancy came in, the fact that deviancy exists in every point of Aqidah. There is a group or a person who took an opinion that was different from the mainstream, and how our Aqidah has survived through the Hadith, the Quran, the Sunnah, and the narrations from the companions radiallahu anhum wa ardahum. And we talked a little bit about the foundation of sort of philosophical thought in Islam, or reasoning in Islam, which came from the Mu'tazila, the Jahmiyyah, the denial of Allah's attributes, the Khawarij and the Shia, and then later on some of the more modern groups like the Asha'ira and the Maturidiyya, and where they got their influences from. And again, there's a lot more to read about that, but that gives you a foundation. And again, the purpose of this is to be as factual as possible, not to offend anybody, but inshallah to be as factual as possible, and to look at these issues in the light of what they really are, and to look at the sort of where the beliefs came from in the light of what they really were. And again, obviously we're going to present what we consider to be the Quran, the Sunnah, and inshallah what I would only like you to do in terms of judging what I said is to judge it against the Quran and the Sunnah, not to judge it against the opinion of the likes of someone like, for example, to judge it against the opinion of a modern book or whatever, but to judge what I said against the Quran and the Sunnah, and against the statements of the companions. And whatever I said agrees with that, then you're welcome to take it. And whatever I've said that doesn't agree with that, then it needs more questioning and it needs more research, inshaAllah tabaraka wa ta'ala. Right, that's taken up sort of 10 minutes. And in terms of moving forward, I think the most important thing for you guys is to look at how you apply this to your own life. To look at your own belief, to look at where your source for that belief is, who you've learned from. Is it your parents? Is it your local masjid? And where that belief has actually come from, and to start to read and purify it. And some people said that one of the greatest ways of honoring your parents is not to copy their mistakes. Because if you copy the mistake of your parents, for example, just because they were who they were, you copy the mistake that they make, at the end of the day you increase in their sin in the sight of Allah, right? Because they have instigated a sin and you've copied it. So how do you do birrul walidain? How do you be honorable to your parents? You be honorable by practicing the truth and teaching the truth. And the truth is not what Muhammad Tim says, but it is what the Quran says and the Sunnah says and the companions radiallahu anhum say. And inshallah, in this way, you are honoring your parents and your ancestors, and you're not disgracing them by doing bad things and then having them share some of the sins in you continuing from their mistakes. So that's an important point about the justification. Well, I can't go against what my parents believe. And then, for you to look at it, for you to correct it, that every time you come across a point of Aqidah that differs from what you used to believe, you find, is it in the Quran, is it in the Sunnah? If it is, you take it, then inshallah ta'ala you'll be successful. And then of course tawbah from whatever we've done that is wrong. And that's more or less, inshallah, the end of the sessions for me. And I'll open it up to questions and answers. I don't think we're going to be kicked out of the room, immediately or anything. But I know people have car parking and stuff like that to deal with. So question and answers, guys, it's entirely up to you. Those who want to stay, ahlan wa sahlan, you're welcome. Those who want to leave, as long as you do so quietly, you're more than welcome to do so, inshallah ta'ala. We'll take one from the brothers, one from the sisters, back and forward, inshallah. And if I think the question is particularly long, we might have to skip it and deal with it in written form or post it on the ISOC Facebook page or something. But inshallah, we try to deal with the questions that we can deal with in the time. Hamza.
Can I ask you, session 5, are we going to postpone it? Or?
No, session 5, more or less I covered what I wanted to talk about. Because I said in session 5 I wanted to talk about moving forward. And I thought that it was enough to talk for 20 minutes about, applying it to your life, about not looking at mistakes, about moving forward, about the Quran and the Sunnah, and about recapping what we've done. I think that's enough for what I wanted to cover for session 5, inshallah. Right, we take a question from the brothers, first of all. Any questions? Do you have any questions from the sisters?
I wanted to ask about the study of kalam, the theory based on rationality. Because I thought the word kalam means speech. Is that the same kalam that is referred to in Ajrumiya, or is that something else?
Okay, kalam, when we see the word kalam referred to in books like of Arabic language, like Al-Ajrumiya, is it the same kalam that's referred to here? No. What we refer to kalam in Arabic means speech. And kalam specifically in the language of the Arabs is a speech that has a meaning to it. Yeah, so al-kalam is defined in Arabic as a sound that has a meaning to it, or a sound that comes out of your mouth that has a meaning to it, something like that. And this sort of sound that you make that has a sort of meaning to it, this is one thing. On the other side, what we're talking about here is what is called ilmul kalam. And ilmul kalam is a branch or a different type of philosophy which is basically to do with basing your religion upon rational thinking rather than basing it upon the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah. And this is what we've been talking about here. The two have the same word, but they have different meanings. This kalam is just general speech, and there's nothing wrong with it. Kalamun Nabi, the kalam of the Prophet ﷺ. But the kalam we're talking about here is a science which sprung out from philosophy, which uses intellect and rationality as a basis for religion. Question from the brothers?
Jazakallah khairan for your lectures.
Well,
I've got a question, about La ilaha illallah, Sheikh. There's a condition which is I have got in my knowledge, which is somebody who has to intentionally have in mind to declare that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad, Messenger of Allah, and condition that inshallah one day bring back Ummah. By doing that, as you mentioned, we have to avoid this kind of stuff. So, by declaring, bringing Ummah back by intention that al-hukm for Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Inna hukmu lillah. That's hukm, the rule has to be the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And
the hukm we have to be careful.
Yes, I just try to make a link.
I'll make a point. This is the same point that has a justification for everything in Islam, because this word was used by the Khawarij as the reason why they killed Ali. When he said, why did you kill Ali? They said, in al-hukmu illa lillah. And Ali said, this is true, but you want evil from it.
Yeah, I was trying to make that additional to your speech. Also, there's a link between this, what you just mentioned, alhamdulillah, all the people who avoid this kind of bid'ahs and has a, salaf way, inshallah. There's some debate between obey your ruler. Back to Sheikh Albani, rahimullah. I just want to support my questions, that's why I bring their name. Sheikh Albani, rahimullah, said in one his statement that against Sheikh Madkhali, that he said Syria, before this revolution, Syria and Iraq, you should, the Ba'siyya, the group al-Ba'siyya, does not matter, you have to obey them. Does not matter killing Muslim and destroying the mosques. So Sheikh Albani in his video, which is published on YouTube, again is what he actually stated, and he said you have to change your mind.
I'll deal with that. Yeah. Let me deal, because otherwise we're going to be here all day.
Okay,
I will deal with two things you mentioned, and that's it. We'll talk about the rest privately. Otherwise, we can be here all day. Right? The first thing is the conditions for La ilaha illallah. This is very beneficial. The first condition of La ilaha illallah is knowledge. The second condition is certainty. The third condition is acceptance. The fourth condition is submission. The fifth condition is truthfulness. The sixth condition is sincerity. And the seventh condition is love. 7 conditions for La ilaha illallah, of which you mentioned sincerity, and I think that was a beneficial point. I want to mention that to everyone. Knowledge. You have to know what you say when you say La ilaha illallah. Just the fact that you say La ilaha illallah is not enough. You have to know what it is when you say La ilaha illallah, what it actually means. So you have to know it. Certainty. You have to be sure in it. You can't say, well, I'm saying La ilaha illallah because I'm hedging my bets. If I say La ilaha illallah and it's true, I'll go to paradise. If I say La ilaha illallah and it's wrong, I won't go to hellfire. No problem. This is not allowed. It has to be based with certainty. Acceptance. You have to accept what it entails. There's no point saying La ilaha illallah and then going and sacrificing to other than Allah. You have to accept what it entails. Submission. You have to submit to it in Islam. It's no good saying La ilaha illallah and then not being a Muslim. You have to say it and you have to submit to it. Truthfulness. You have to be truthful in what you say, that you're actually not lying. You actually really mean what you're saying. Sincerity. It has to be for Allah alone, not because your parents want you to be Muslim, not because your family wants you to be Muslim. And likewise, you have to have the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is your guide and which is your primary reason for doing everything. Regarding your point on the Ba'athiyya and Iraq and Syria, this is a very good point. And I deliberately didn't want to get into mentioning countries. I did mention, however, Bashar al-Assad, and I did mention that he was a disbeliever without any disagreement in Islam. But rebelling against a disbeliever has conditions. So we're going to write down the conditions
try to say
for rebelling against a disbeliever. So let's imagine that there is a disbeliever, a disbelieving Muslim ruler who's completely left Islam, like Bashar al-Assad. The first condition is ability. You must be able to rebel. Not simply that, you and me and two of the brothers are going to go and rebel against him, and we're going to get ourselves killed and lots of other people killed. You have to have the military ability to do it. Number two, you have to have the ability or a plan to put an Islamic ruler in place. Why? If you rebel against Bashar al-Assad and you replace Bashar al-Assad with democracy, you've just replaced one type of kufr with another type of kufr. You have not replaced kufr with Islam, and so you haven't done anything in the sight of Allah, because Islam came to remove evil or to reduce it. But if you replace Bashar al-Assad with Bashar al-Assad version 2, you have just replaced evil with evil. But if you put an Islamic ruler in place, then yes, that is good. And the third one, that the positive consequences outweigh the negative. So for example, I would ask you, are the number of people in Syria who are dying today worth it for removing Bashar al-Assad in the context of being able to put someone Muslim in place and the ability to do so? That's not a question I'm going to answer. I'm going to leave that with you to think about. But this is an important point. You have to have the ability to remove him. So you have armies, like you see the Free Syrian Army, they have an army to remove him with. It's not just like two guys who just decided we're going to remove him. They have to be able to put a Muslim ruler in place, and they have to think that the positive consequences outweigh the negative. This goes back to who? Not you and me, this goes back to the scholars in Islam, the senior people, and what we call Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. And Ahlul Halli wal Aqd are those people who together they govern a country. So if you imagine the generals of the army, the head of the, some of the people who are leaving Bashar al-Assad now and joining the other side, the generals, the leaders, like the heads of the parliament, the speaker of the parliament, the head of this, these senior people, along with the scholars, and we would say sort of senior power brokers, if you like. These are the two people in the Quran who are mentioned as having the authority to declare this rebellion. The scholars and the senior power brokers, those people who hold the power in the country. We call them in Arabic Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, the people who control the power in the country. Those and the scholars, they are the ones who have the ability to decide this. But we can look at a situation and say, maybe it's changed. Maybe in the beginning we wouldn't have said to people, rebel against him. But now, What choice do they have? If they don't rebel against him, he's going to take everybody. So, maybe now we can say that it's better to rebel. But the point is that these issues are difficult and they're complicated. What I'm trying to give you are principles, not specific situations. So I'm not talking about any country specifically, but we're talking about there are conditions for rebelling against a disbelieving ruler, and those conditions are well established in the Quran and in the Sunnah. Well, yeah. Right. You can make as many announcements as you want. Any last questions? Anything really urgent anyone wants to say?
My question is about the deviance. Some people, they don't have the knowledge to know these things and their sources. So you have to have one of your scholar or one of the leader of your community to lead you. So what?
I said that there's nothing wrong with taking help from somebody. But you can't turn around to Allah on the Day of Judgment and say, I believe in this because this guy told me. You have to have your own belief for yourself. And Allah doesn't require for you to have all of the knowledge of Islam today. But that every time you learn something is true from the Quran or the Sunnah, you stick to it. And you try not to go against it with your opinion or with anything else. Inshallah, if you do this, Allah will save you from all of the, this deviancy and these issues, inshallah. So it's important, there's no doubt we need help. Today, I was a reason, inshallah, to sort of help you guys to understand these points. But I'm not telling you to take them from me blindly. I'm telling you that each of you have to be convinced with the argument yourselves, and each of you have to come to the truth yourselves, and whatever you find from the Sunnah, accept it, and whatever you find goes against the Sunnah, then we don't accept it, inshallah ta'ala. Okay guys, inshallah, we wrap it up for there. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك